Put that down, mother. You're hovering, and it's making the salmon nervous. I didn't turn around immediately. I kept my hand hovering over the cast iron skillet, feeling the heat radiate against my palm. It's a specific kind of heat, one I've managed for 30 years in this house. I wasn't hovering, I was listening. The sizzle of the butter tells you when it's ready to receive the garlic. If you rush it, the garlic burns. If you wait too long, the butter loses its nuttiness. I was just checking the sear. I said, my voice low, like the hum of the refrigerator. I have a culinary degree, remember? She stepped into the light of the range hood. She looked polished, sharp, and entirely too young to be so arrogant. I think I can handle a piece of fish without your supervision. Why don't you go sit in the sunroom? The light is lovely this time of year, and you won't be underfoot. I set the salt shaker down. It made a soft thud on the granite. Granite I paid for, with the inheritance my own mother left me. Underfoot, I repeated. The word tasted like copper. You know what I mean, she said, offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a practiced, clinical expression. This is a big night for David. His partners are coming over. We need everything to be precise, minimalist. Your style is a bit heavy for the palate we're hosting tonight. I looked at her, really looked at her. She was wearing an apron I'd never seen before. Linen. Expensive. It was tied tight around her waist, a cinch that signaled her new authority over my kitchen. My son, David, was in the foyer, laughing at something on his phone. He didn't see the way she moved me aside with her elbow. He didn't see the way she looked at my spice rack as if it were a collection of dusty relics. Precision is important. I agreed. I took a step back, yielding the space. Exactly, she snapped, already turning her back to me. Oh, and mother? I moved those old jars of yours, the ones with the handwritten labels. They were cluttering up the aesthetic. I put them in the garage. We'll figure out what to do with them later. I felt a slight shift in the air, a microscopic tear in the fabric of our domestic peace. Those jars weren't just spices. They were the history of my hands. My grandmother's dried thyme, my aunt's cayenne blend. To her, they were clutter. To me, they were the foundation of every meal that had ever nourished the man she now called her husband. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply smoothed the front of my silk blouse and walked toward the sunroom. I sat in the wicker chair, the one that creaks just enough to let you know it's holding you. From there, I could see the reflection of the kitchen in the glass of the French doors. I watched her. She moved with a frenetic energy, a desperation to prove she was the new architect of this home. She threw away the lemon peels I'd saved for zest. She wiped down surfaces that were already clean. She thought she was taking control. She thought she was erasing me, one old habit at a time. But she forgot one thing about people who move slowly. We see the things the fast movers miss. I saw the way she didn't check the expiration on the heavy cream she'd bought from that boutique market. I saw the way she left the back door unlocked because she liked the breeze. Most importantly, I saw the small white envelope she'd tucked under the fruit bowl when she thought I was upstairs, the one with the logo of a real estate firm David told me he'd stopped working with months ago. The disrespect in the kitchen was just a symptom. The disease was much deeper. She wasn't just trying to take over the dinner menu. She was preparing to move the chess pieces of my entire life while I was supposed to be napping in the sunroom. She thinks 58 is the age where the mind begins to soften, like overripe fruit. She thinks my silence is a white flag. She has no idea that silence is actually a workshop. I reached into my pocket and felt the small brass key that didn't belong to any door in this house. I turned it over in my fingers, feeling its cold, jagged edges. The salmon was starting to smell like it was sticking to the pan. She was talking too loud into her headset now, managing a guest list, oblivious to the physics of the stove. "Mother," she called out, not looking my way, "could you make sure you stay in here when the guests arrive? I don't want you wandering into the dining room in those gardening shoes." I wasn't wearing gardening shoes. I was wearing Italian leather loafers. But facts didn't matter to her. Only the narrative did. And in her narrative, I was a ghost haunting my own hallways. "I'll stay exactly where I need to be," I said softly. The first guest rang the doorbell. David's voice boomed in the hallway. The evening was beginning. She thought this was her grand debut as the woman of the house. She had no idea that the note I'd left on the counter wasn't a recipe for her sauce. It was the first sentence of a very different story. She thinks she has cleared the clutter, but she's forgotten the most basic rule of the kitchen. Never turn your back on something that's already at a boiling point. By the time the main course is served, she'll realize that being underfoot is the best place to be when you're planning to trip someone. The question isn't whether she will fail tonight. The question is, how much is she willing to lose before she realizes I'm the one holding the bill? The oven timer just chimed, but the real heat hasn't even started. The dining room was a theater of curated perfection, or at least that's what she intended. I watched from the periphery, standing near the sideboard where the shadows were longest. My daughter-in-law, whom I'll call Simone for the sake of the narrative, was flitting between the guests like a nervous hummingbird. She had replaced my linen tablecloth, the hand-embroidered one from my wedding, with a slate gray runner that looked like a strip of asphalt. "Everything is so modern," Simone, one of David's partners, remarked, tilting his head. He was a man named Miller, someone who smelled of expensive scotch and old money. He looked at the minimalist table setting with an expression that bordered on confusion. "Where is that wonderful centerpiece your mother-in-law usually puts out? The one with the hand-carved wood?" Simone's laugh was brittle, like dry leaves underfoot. "Oh, we decided to go in a more streamlined direction tonight, Miller. We're looking toward the future, aren't we, David?" David, my son, looked up from his wine glass. He looked tired. There were bags under his eyes that hadn't been there a month ago. He glanced at me, then quickly looked away, caught in that uncomfortable middle ground between the woman who raised him and the woman who now dictated the temperature of his life. "Right," he murmured, "the future." I remained silent, a glass of sparkling water in my hand. I wasn't drinking. I needed my mind sharp, my observations clinical. I watched Simone serve the salmon. It was overcooked. I could tell by the way the edges curled, desperate for the moisture she had failed to seal in. She had ignored the cast iron. She had used a nonstick pan because it was easier to clean. She hadn't just ignored the pan, though. She had ignored the foundation. "Mother," Simone said, her voice cutting through the dinner conversation with the sharpness of a scalpel. "You're being so quiet. Why don't you tell Miller and the others about your little hobbies? The gardening? The jars in the garage?" The table went quiet. It was a calculated move, a social demotion. She wanted them to see me as a harmless, slightly eccentric relic of a bygone era, a woman whose only contribution to the world was dirt and glass. "My hobbies involve patience," I said, my voice steady and low. I let the words hang in the air for a beat longer than necessary. In the garden, you learn that things take time to grow and even longer to rot. You learn that if you pull a weed too early, the roots stay behind. You have to wait until the ground is soft enough to take the whole thing. Miller blinked. He was a smart man. He felt the shift in temperature. Simone, however, just tilted her head and gave a condescending little chirp. "How poetic! Anyway, David, tell them about the new expansion project." As David began to speak, his voice lacking the usual passion he had for his work, I moved closer to the table to refill a water carafe. As I leaned in, I caught the scent of Simone's perfume. It was heavy, floral, and entirely too much for a dinner party. But beneath the floral notes, I smelled something else. Metallic, faint. I caught sight of her phone, sitting face up on the corner of the table. A notification slid across the screen. It was a text message from a contact, saved only as V. Everything is ready for the 15th. Does he suspect? I didn't blink. I didn't pause my pouring. I finished the task and stepped back into the shadows. The 15th was less than a week away. That was the date David was supposed to sign the final papers for his firm's merger. Or, more accurately, the date he thought he was securing his legacy. I looked at the note I had left on the kitchen counter earlier. It was still there, tucked under the corner of the fruit bowl. Simone hadn't even bothered to read it. She thought it was a grocery list. She thought I was incapable of writing anything that could threaten her carefully constructed aesthetic. The fish is a bit dry, isn't it? Miller whispered to his wife. Simone didn't hear him. She was too busy checking her reflection in the darkened window. She was admiring the crown. She thought she had already won. She didn't realize that in this house, the walls have ears and the floorboards have memories. And I have the keys. I began to catalog the guests, not just their names, but their weaknesses. Miller was vain. His wife was observant but bored. The younger associate, a man named Henderson, was looking at David with a mixture of pity and ambition. Simone was trying to impress them, but she was playing the wrong game. She was playing checkers while the board was set for something much older. As the plates were cleared, Simone leaned over to me, her breath hot against my ear. See, I told you. They love the new vibe. You can head up to your room now. We're going to discuss adult business over coffee. Of course, I said, a ghost of a smile touching my lips. I wouldn't want to be in the way of the consequences. I walked toward the stairs, but I didn't go to my room. I went to the garage. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and cedar. There, on a workbench Simone had designated as junk space, sat my jars. I reached for the one in the back. It wasn't filled with spices. It was filled with small, folded slips of paper, receipts, bank statements, and legal filings I'd been collecting since the day she moved in. She thought she was the one with the culinary degree, but she didn't realize that I had been the one seasoning the environment for months. I opened the jar and pulled out a single document. It was a deed, not to this house. I already owned that, but to the property Simone had been secretly trying to leverage. The social tension in the dining room was just the overture. The real symphony was about to begin, and it was a composition Simone wouldn't know how to conduct. She wanted a minimalist life. I was about to show her just how little she truly had left. The sound of laughter drifted from the dining room, followed by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Simone's heels on the hardwood. She was coming this way. I didn't hide the jar. I didn't need to. In her eyes, I was already invisible. The clicking of Simone's heels stopped just outside the garage door. I didn't move. I stood in the cool, dim light of the workbench, the deed in my hand feeling like a heavy secret. The door creaked open, and a sliver of warm light from the kitchen spilled across the concrete floor. "Mother, what are you doing out here in the dark?" Her voice was tight, the practiced charm of the dinner party wearing thin. "It's freezing, and frankly, it's a bit creepy." I turned slowly, letting the document slide back into the jar with a dry, papery whisper. "The darkness is where you see the things that the light hides, Simone. It's quite peaceful." She stepped into the garage, her eyes darting around the shelves of clutter she so despised. She didn't look at the jars. She looked at me as if I were a stain she couldn't quite scrub out. "David is asking for the dessert plates. Since you insisted on keeping them in the high cabinets where I can't reach, I suggest you come in and get them. And then please go to bed." I walked past her, the scent of her perfume clashing with the honest smell of the cedar. The high cabinets were built for people with a long reach. I said softly, "I'll get them for you." As I entered the kitchen, the remnants of the overcooked salmon sat on the counter, looking gray and defeated. The guests were still in the dining room, their voices rising in a crescendo of forced laughter and business jargon. I reached for the step stool, not because I needed it, but because I knew it made me look fragile. I climbed it slowly, my movements deliberate. From my elevated position, I looked down at the fruit bowl. The note was gone. My heart didn't skip a beat. It simply settled into a firmer rhythm. Simone had finally found it. Or perhaps David had. I glanced through the doorway. David was leaning against the sideboard, his face pale. He wasn't looking at his guests. He was looking at a small, yellowed piece of paper in his hand. It wasn't a grocery list. It was a receipt from 1998 for the original survey of the land this house sat on, land that had been in my family since long before David was born. At the bottom, in my handwriting, I had added a single sentence. "The roots are deeper than the foundation." "David," Simone called out, walking back into the dining room. "Is something wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's nothing," David said, his voice cracking slightly. He quickly shoved the paper into his pocket, just thinking about the merger. I descended the stool, the dessert plates stacked neatly in my arms. Porcelain, bone china, thin enough to see the light through, yet remarkably hard to break. I walked into the dining room and began to set them down. One for Miller, one for his wife, one for Henderson. "I thought you were going to bed, Mother," Simone said, her eyes narrowing. She didn't like the way the guests looked at the plates, the way they recognized the quality she had tried to replace with her minimalist stoneware. "I realized I forgot to offer the special tea," I said, my voice as smooth as river stone. "It's a family blend, very calming for a long night of negotiations." "We don't need tea," Simone snapped. "I'd love some," Miller interjected, his curiosity piqued. "Your mother-in-law has a way with flavors, Simone. You'd be wise to learn from her." The silence that followed was heavy with a new kind of tension. Social embarrassment is a powerful tool. It's a quiet weapon that leaves no bruises, but creates deep fissures. Simone's face flushed a deep, angry red, but she forced a smile. "Of course," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Mother, go make the tea." I returned to the kitchen. I didn't make the tea immediately. Instead, I stood by the back door, the one Simone had left unlocked for the breeze. I stepped out onto the porch for a moment. The night air was crisp. I looked toward the edge of the property, where the old oak trees stood like sentinels. I saw a car parked at the end of the driveway. Its lights were off, but the silhouette was unmistakable. A black sedan, the same one I had seen following Simone 3 days ago, when she claimed she was at the florist. I whispered to the night. The pieces were moving faster now. Simone wasn't just trying to take my kitchen. She was trying to liquidate the estate to cover a debt David didn't know existed. She thought she was the predator, circling a weakened prey. She didn't realize she was the one being lured into a very specific kind of trap. I went back inside and put the kettle on. The whistle began as a low moan, rising to a sharp, insistent cry. It was the only loud thing in the house. I carried the tray back into the dining room. As I poured the tea, I leaned close to Henderson, the ambitious associate. He was the one Simone had been flirting with all evening, the one she thought was her ally in the merger. "You should check the signatures on the third-party disclosures, Mr. Henderson," I murmured as I set his cup down. "Sometimes the most important names are the ones that are missing." Henderson froze. He looked at me, his eyes widening. I didn't wait for a response. I moved on to the next guest, my face a mask of elderly politeness. Simone was watching me, her hands clenched under the table. She knew I had said something, but she didn't know what. She was losing control of the room, and she could feel it slipping away like sand through her fingers. Well, Simone said, standing up abruptly, I think it's time we wrap things up. David and I have a very early morning. We do? David asked, looking up from his tea. He looked confused, lost in the fog of the evening. Yes, David. The bank. Remember? Simone's voice was like a whip. The guests began to filter out, offering their polite thanks. Miller lingered for a moment, shaking my hand. That was quite a meal, he said, his eyes searching mine. And the tea, it has a very interesting aftertaste. Bittersweet. That's the chicory. I said, it stays with you. When the last car door slammed and the house was finally quiet, Simone turned on me. The mask was gone. The modern woman was replaced by a creature of pure, unadulterated venom. I want you out, she hissed, stepping into my personal space. I've talked to David. We're looking at assisted living facilities tomorrow. This house is too big for you, and your interference is no longer welcome. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I looked at her, my 58 years of life distilled into a single cold gaze. You're right about one thing, Simone, I said. The house is too big, but it's not for me to leave. We'll see about that, she said, spinning on her heel and heading upstairs. I stayed in the dining room, surrounded by the wreckage of her perfect dinner. I picked up Simone's phone, which she had forgotten on the table in her haste to confront me. It was unlocked. I scrolled through the messages from V. The documents are forged. If David signs on the 15th, the house belongs to us. You get your cut and your freedom. I put the phone back, exactly where I found it. The 15th was coming. And Simone was right. We would see. The next morning didn't start with a confrontation. It started with a vacuum. Simone was awake at 6 a.m., the aggressive hum of the machine thumping against the baseboards of my bedroom door. It was a rhythmic, mechanical eviction notice. She wasn't just cleaning. She was scrubbing away the scent of my presence. I lay in bed, watching the dust motes dance in a sliver of dawn light, my mind already 3 moves ahead. When I finally descended the stairs, the house smelled of industrial bleach and artificial citrus, the scent of a hotel, not a home. David was sitting at the kitchen island, staring into a cup of black coffee. Simone was standing over him, a tablet in her hand, her finger tapping rapidly against the screen. This one in the valley is top tier, David, she said, her voice bright and artificial. They have a botanical garden, a library. It's basically a resort. Mother would be so much more comfortable there than dealing with these stairs. David didn't look up. She's 58, Simone, not 85. She's not dealing with the stairs. She's the one who polished them. It's about the future, Simone snapped, the brightness faltering. We need this space. If we're going to host the board members for the merger celebration, we need a guest suite, not a storage room for old jars and memories. I entered the kitchen quietly. I didn't head for the stove. I headed for the cupboard and pulled out a single chipped ceramic mug, the one David had made for me in the 3rd grade. It was the only cluttered item she hadn't managed to hide yet. The valley is lovely this time of year, I said, my voice startling them both. But the soil is too acidic for hydrangeas. They'd turn blue. I prefer them pink. Simone stiffened. Mother, we were just discussing options. Options are a luxury, I replied, leaning against the counter. But I think David has enough on his plate with the merger. Don't you, son? David finally looked at me. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or a submerged memory of the woman who had worked 3 jobs to ensure he never had to worry about options. The merger is complicated, Ma. It doesn't have to be, I said, taking a slow sip of water. As long as everyone is being honest. Honesty is like a clean kitchen. You don't have to worry about what's hidden in the corners. Simone's eyes flashed. She knew exactly what I was doing. She reached out and placed a hand on David's shoulder, her manicured nails digging slightly into his shirt. David, we're going to be late for the meeting with the appraisers. Why don't you go get the car? I'll finish up here. David nodded, looking relieved to escape the heavy atmosphere. As soon as the front door clicked shut, Simone's facade crumbled. She stepped toward me, her face inches from mine. You think you're so clever with your riddles, she hissed, but it doesn't matter. The papers are already being processed. David is signing the power of attorney this afternoon. By the 15th, I'll have the legal right to move you wherever I want. You're a relic, and relics belong in museums. Or basements. I looked at the small, red smudge of lipstick on her front tooth. It was a tiny imperfection in her otherwise flawless mask. Power of attorney is a heavy responsibility, Simone. I hope you've read the fine print. Sometimes, when you give someone the power to act on your behalf, you also give them the power to fall in your place. Save it for your diary. She sneered. She grabbed her designer bag and headed for the door. And don't bother cooking. We're eating out tonight. I don't want the house smelling like whatever it is you do. I watched her car pull out of the driveway. I didn't feel anger. Anger is an emotion that burns energy, and I needed every spark of mine for the work ahead. I went to the basement, not to the storage room she expected, but to the small, cedar-lined closet behind the furnace. It was a space David didn't even know existed. Inside was a small fireproof safe. I keyed in the code, David's birth date. A number he had forgotten was the key to my protection. I pulled out a thick envelope. Inside were the original bank records from 20 years ago when I had placed the house and the surrounding acreage into a private trust. A trust that required 2 signatures for any transfer of property. Mine and the executor's. The executor wasn't David. It was a man named Miller. The same Miller who had been sitting at my dinner table last night. The same Miller who had tasted the bittersweet chicory and recognized the look in my eyes. I took the envelope to the kitchen table and spread the documents out. I compared them to the digital copies I had surreptitiously photographed from Simone's phone. The forgery was skilled, but it lacked the one thing that made the original valid. The raised seal of the county clerk from a year when the clerk happened to be my second cousin. Simone thought she was playing a game of speed. She thought that if she moved fast enough, the momentum would carry her over the lies. But a house built on a lie is like a house built on sand. It only takes one well-placed wave to wash it all away. I picked up the house phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Miller? It's Pearl. I think it's time we had that tea we discussed, not the calming blend, the one with the kick. I listened as Miller spoke on the other end. He was a man of business, but he was also a man of loyalty. He had known my late husband. He knew what this house meant. The 15th, Miller said, his voice crackling through the line. That's the deadline, Pearl. Are you sure you want to wait that long? The longer the fruit stays on the vine, I said, watching a crow land on the bird feeder outside. The sweeter the harvest. I want her to feel like she's already won. I want her to see the finish line before she realizes the track has been moved. I hung up the phone and began to prepare a light lunch. Not for Simone, but for myself. I needed the strength. As I ate, I noticed something on the floor near the pantry. A small white pill. I picked it up. It wasn't aspirin. It was a powerful sedative, the kind usually prescribed for extreme anxiety or to induce sleep. I looked at the coffee pot David had been drinking from. The house was silent when Simone returned from her yoga session, but the silence felt different now. It was charged like the air before a lightning strike. I was in the living room, knitting a sweater David would likely never wear, my needles clicking a steady, rhythmic pulse. Simone didn't speak to me. She grabbed her minimalist water bottle from the counter, took a deep, triumphant swig, and headed upstairs to shower. I waited. 5 minutes later, I heard the sound of a plastic bottle hitting the tile floor. Then, a muffled gasp. It wasn't a scream. The oil is too clever for that. It creates a sensation of heat so intense that the brain forgets how to form words. It feels like swallowing a live coal. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked upstairs. I didn't rush. I moved with the grace of a woman who has all the time in the world. I found her leaning against the bathroom vanity, her face flushed, her eyes streaming with tears. She was frantically splashing cold water into her mouth, but water only spreads the oil. "Is something wrong, Simone?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "You look a bit overheated." She tried to glare at me, but her eyes were too bloodshot to carry any weight. She pointed a trembling finger at the water bottle. "Maybe it was the lemon," I suggested, my voice a soothing balm over her panic. "Some people have a very strong reaction to acidity. Or perhaps it's just the body's way of rejecting something it knows shouldn't be there. Like a lie." She pushed past me, stumbling toward the bedroom, her hand over her mouth. She wouldn't be speaking for a few hours. Her throat would feel like it had been scrubbed with sandpaper. Most importantly, she wouldn't be able to talk David into anything this evening. I went back downstairs to find David entering through the kitchen door. He looked worse than this morning. His movements were heavy, his eyes unfocused. He slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. "Ma," he groaned, "I don't know what's wrong with me. I feel like I'm walking through molasses." I walked over to him and placed my hand on his forehead. It was cool. The sedative she was using didn't cause fever. It caused apathy. "You've been under a lot of pressure, David. The merger, the house. Maybe it's not the work. Maybe it's what you're putting in your body." I took his coffee mug, the one he'd been using all week, and set it in the sink. I replaced it with a glass of water and a small plate of sliced apples I'd prepared. "Eat these. The natural sugars will help clear the fog." "Simone says I need to rest," he mumbled, reaching for an apple slice. "She says the signing on the 15th is just a formality, but I feel like I'm signing my life away." "The 15th is only 3 days away," I said, pulling up a chair beside him. "If you feel like you're signing your life away, David, it's because you are. This house isn't just wood and stone. It's the breath of your father. It's the sweat of my brow. If you let it go, you aren't just moving me out. You're erasing yourself." David looked at me, and for a second, the fog seemed to lift. A spark of the boy I raised, the one who used to protect his handmade gifts with his life, flickered in his gaze. "She said we were in debt, Ma. She said the firm was failing. Is it the firm that's failing, or is it Simone's appetite for a life she didn't earn?" I asked quietly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. Not the deed, not yet. It was a printout of the text message I'd seen on her phone from V. I transcribed it carefully. David read the words. I watched his jaw tighten. I watched the realization wash over him like cold water. The sedative was strong, but betrayal is a powerful stimulant. "Who is V?" he whispered. "V is the person she's selling your legacy to," I said. "And if you sign those papers on Tuesday, you'll be giving her the pen to write your eviction notice along with mine." He stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. He looked toward the stairs, toward the room where his wife was currently nursing a burnt throat and a crumbling plan. "Don't," I said, my voice commanding. "If you confront her now, she'll pivot. She'll cry. She'll play the victim. And you, because you have your father's heart, will forgive her. We aren't looking for a confrontation, David. We are looking for a resolution. What do? We wait," I said. "We let her think the oil is just a fluke. We let her think you're still in the fog. And on the 15th, when she takes you to that meeting, you're going to bring a guest." I didn't tell him who. I didn't need to. I spent the rest of the evening cleaning the kitchen, truly cleaning it. I moved her minimalist canisters and found the layer of dust she'd ignored. I wiped down the baseboards. I reclaimed the space, inch by inch. Upstairs, I heard Simone pacing. The pacing of a trapped animal. She couldn't talk, so she couldn't manipulate. She was left alone with her thoughts. And for someone like her, that is the most dangerous place to be. I went to my room and opened my wardrobe. At the very back, tucked behind my Sunday dresses, was a small, black lacquered box. I opened it and took out a pair of earrings. Pearls. Real ones. They were a gift from Miller's wife years ago. I put them on. I looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't see an underfoot mother-in-law. I didn't see a relic. I saw a woman who had survived the storms of the past and was currently brewing one of her own. The 15th was coming, and for the first time in weeks, the air in the house felt clean. As I turned out the light, I thought about the note I'd left for Simone. The one she'd eventually find in her yoga bag. It only had 4 words on it, written in the elegant, steady hand she found so old-fashioned. Watch your step, Simone. The day before the 15th was the quietest the house had ever been. Simone had regained her voice, but she used it sparingly. The burn had left her cautious, her movements jerky and suspicious. She no longer paced. She hovered at the edge of rooms, watching me as if I were a ticking clock she couldn't figure out how to dismantle. She had tried to apologize to David for the lemon incident, but David played his part perfectly. He remained slumped, nodding vaguely, the image of a man still lost in a medicinal haze. I had spent the morning brewing a special toning tea for him, purely herbal, designed to flush the last of the sedatives from his system without Simone noticing the change in his clarity. We need to leave by 9 tomorrow, Simone said during dinner. She wasn't eating. She was pushing a piece of steamed asparagus around a white plate. The lawyers are very particular about timing. If we're late, the merger terms might shift. The timing is everything, I agreed. I was eating a hearty bowl of stew, the steam carrying the scent of rosemary and defiance. A second too early, and the bloom is lost. A second too late, and the rot sets in. Simone's fork scraped against the porcelain, a sharp, shrill sound. Do you ever speak without using a metaphor, Mother? It's exhausting. Truth is often too heavy to carry directly, I said, meeting her gaze. Metaphors give us handles. She looked away first. She was fraying. The silence I had cultivated was acting like a mirror, reflecting her own guilt and anxiety back at her. She didn't know how to handle a woman who didn't scream, didn't cry, and didn't pack her bags. After dinner, I saw her slip into the garage. I followed a few minutes later, staying in the shadows of the laundry room. I watched through the window as she approached my shelf of jars. She was looking for something, perhaps the lemon or whatever she thought had caused her agony. She reached for the jar of ghost pepper oil, her hand trembling. But she stopped. She remembered the heat. She remembered the inability to breathe. She backed away, her face pale in the fluorescent light. Instead of touching my jars, she turned to the corner where her V had likely told her to hide the final set of papers. She pulled a black folder from behind a stack of David's old college textbooks. She opened it, checking the contents one last time. I saw the flash of the gold seal, the forgery. She clutched it to her chest like a shield. I didn't stop her. I didn't reveal myself. I wanted her to take that folder to the meeting. I wanted her to present it as her masterstroke. I went back to the sunroom and sat in the dark. David joined me a few minutes later. He didn't turn on the light. He sat on the footstool at my feet, the way he used to when he was a boy afraid of the thunder. I called Miller, Ma, he whispered. He told me everything about the trust. Why didn't you tell me years ago? Because a man doesn't appreciate the roof until he feels the rain, I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. You needed to see the storm for yourself, David. You needed to see who was holding the umbrella and who was poking holes in the shingles. I feel like a fool, he said, his voice thick with shame. A fool is someone who ignores the truth when it's presented. I replied, a student is someone who learns from the lie. Tomorrow you graduate. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the moon rise over the oak trees. Outside, the black sedan was gone. V was likely preparing for their big payday. Simone was likely upstairs, dreaming of a minimalist life funded by the sale of a soul she didn't own. I thought about the 58 years I had spent building a reputation for kindness, for patience, for old-school values. Simone thought those values made me weak. She thought they made me a victim of the modern world's ruthlessness. She was about to learn that old school doesn't mean obsolete. It means tested. It means that while she was studying the trends of the future, I was mastering the laws of consequence. I had seen women like her come and go in this neighborhood for decades, women who thought they could trade history for a faster car or a sleeker kitchen. They always forgot that history has a way of repeating itself, especially when there's someone around to remind it of the steps. Go to sleep, David, I said. You'll need your strength for the signing. And you, Ma? I have a few more jars to organize, I said. I waited until the house was completely still. Then I went to the kitchen. I didn't look for documents. I didn't look for poison. I simply took a small silver key from the velvet lining of my jewelry box, the key to the desk in the library that Simone thought was just a decorative antique. I opened the desk and pulled out a single handheld tape recorder. It was an old model, the kind that used microcassettes. I checked the battery. I pressed play. Just keep him sedated until Tuesday. Once the signature is on the trust bypass, we can move her to the facility in the valley. The realtor said the property value alone will cover the debt and leave us with a $3 million cushion. David won't even realize the house is gone until the movers arrive. Simone's voice was clear, clinical, and devastating. I stopped the recording. I didn't feel a sting. I felt a cold, professional satisfaction. The psychological conflict was over. The power dynamics had shifted. Simone thought she was the architect, but I was the one who had built the room she was standing in. And tomorrow, I was going to close the door. I tucked the recorder into my purse right next to the real deed. And the pearls. The morning of the 15th was gray and drizzly, perfect weather for a funeral or a closing. Simone was dressed in a sharp ivory power suit. She looked like a woman who had already won. She handed David his briefcase, her touch lingering on his arm in a way that would have looked affectionate to anyone who didn't know she was checking his pulse for compliance. "Ready, honey?" she asked, her voice a melodic chime. David looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't blink. "Ready." They walked toward the door. Simone didn't even look at me. She treated me like a piece of furniture they were planning to leave behind for the next owners. "Mother, we'll be back by noon," she said over her shoulder. "Try not to make a mess in the kitchen." "I won't," I said, standing in the foyer, the light of the chandelier catching the pearls at my ears. "In fact, I think by the time you get back, everything will be perfectly clean." The door closed. I waited 30 seconds. Then I picked up my coat and walked to the garage. I didn't take my car. I took the old truck David's father had left me, the one Simone called an eyesore. I had a meeting of my own, and unlike Simone, I wasn't bringing a forgery. The office of the real estate firm was a glass-walled cage, high above the city, designed to make people feel small. It was all chrome, white leather, and filtered air, the kind of environment Simone thrived in. When I arrived, I didn't go to the reception desk. I walked straight to the executive conference room. I could see them through the glass. Simone was sitting at the head of the table, the black folder open before her. David sat to her right, his face a mask of practiced indifference. Opposite them sat a man in a tailored charcoal suit. He was younger than I expected, with the slick, hungry eyes of a shark that had never known a day of hunger. I pushed the heavy glass door open. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crack the floor. "Mother!" Simone's voice hit a register that was almost a shatter. She stood up, her ivory suit gleaming under the LED lights. "What are you doing here? This is a private legal matter. You're confused. David, tell her." David didn't move. He didn't look up. He looked at the fountain pen in front of him as if it were a strange artifact. "I'm not confused, Simone," I said, walking to the foot of the table. I didn't sit. I stood, my presence an anchor in the middle of their artificial world. "I believe I'm exactly where the owner of the property should be." V chuckled, a dry, metallic sound. "Simone, you didn't tell me the help was so spirited." "Ma'am, the power of attorney is already in effect. This is just the formalization of the trust transfer. Perhaps you should wait in the lobby. There's a lovely espresso machine." I turned my gaze to him. I didn't speak. I simply let the weight of my observations settle on him until his smile faltered. People like V rely on the idea that the elderly are invisible. When you look at them directly, really look at them, they realize they are the ones who are transparent. "Mr. Jackson, if that is your real name," I began, using a name I knew he'd recognize from the fraudulent filings, "I'm curious about the $3 million cushion you promised Simone. Does that come before or after you liquidate the acreage to the development group in Chicago?" Simone's face went from ivory to the color of ash. I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do," I said. I reached into my purse and pulled out the small, black tape recorder. I set it on the table. "You have a very distinctive voice, Simone, even when you're talking about drugging your husband and disposing of his mother." I pressed play. The room filled with the sound of her own betrayal. David's hand tightened around the pen until his knuckles turned white. V leaned back, his eyes darting toward the door. He was a professional. He knew when a ship was sinking. "This is inadmissible," Simone hissed, though her hands were shaking so violently she had to grip the edge of the table. "This is a violation of privacy. David, she's trying to ruin us. She's trying to take away our future." David finally looked up. He didn't look at me. He looked at Simone. The fog was entirely gone now, replaced by a cold, crystalline anger. "The future you bought with my father's house, or the one you bought with the pills you put in my coffee." "David, I did it for us." "You did it for V," David said, his voice a low growl. "Enough," I said. The word wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a blade. I looked at V. "Mr. Vance, I believe you have some documents in that folder that carry a very specific gold seal. A seal that hasn't been used by the county clerk in 5 years. Forgery of a deed is a felony. Conspiracy to defraud is another. I wonder, how many years do you think those add up to?" V stood up slowly. He didn't look at Simone. He didn't even look at the folder. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was brought in as a consultant. I had no idea the documents were irregular." "You're leaving?" Simone gasped, reaching for his sleeve. "We have a contract." V brushed her hand off as if she were a piece of lint. "Our contract is based on the validity of the assets. If the assets are contested, the contract is void. Good luck, Simone." He walked out of the room, his heels clicking a much faster rhythm than Simone's ever had. He was gone before the glass door finished swinging shut. Simone turned back to us, her eyes wide, her chest heaving. She looked like a cornered animal, but even now, she was looking for a way to pivot. She looked at David, her eyes filling with tears. "David, baby, he manipulated me. He threatened me. I was just trying to save the firm. I didn't mean those things on the tape. I was scared." David stood up. He looked taller than I'd seen him in years. He didn't touch her. He didn't even move toward her. "The firm isn't failing, Simone," David said. "I checked the books this morning. The only debt we have is the one you created in my name, the one you thought my mother would pay for with her life." "I'm your wife," she screamed, the modern facade finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. "You can't do this. I have rights." "You have the right to remain silent," I said, stepping forward, "though I doubt you'll find that as easy as I did." I pulled the real deed from my purse and laid it on the table. Then I pulled out a second document, a restraining order signed by Miller's firm an hour ago. "The locks have already been changed, Simone," I said, "and your minimalist wardrobe is currently sitting in 3 cardboard boxes at the end of the driveway, in the rain." Simone looked at the deed, then at David, then at me. She realized then that the underfoot mother-in-law hadn't been a victim. I hadn't been waiting to be moved. I had been waiting for her to move herself right out of the equation. "You're a monster," she whispered. "No," I said, my voice calm and observant. "I'm a gardener, and I've just finished pulling the weeds." I turned to David. "Come, son, we have a kitchen to reclaim. I believe the salmon is long overdue for a proper sear." As we walked out of the glass-walled cage, leaving Simone standing alone in the middle of her failed heist, I didn't look back. The air in the hallway felt crisp and clean, but as we reached the elevator, I felt a slight vibration in my purse. I pulled out my phone, a text from an unknown number, the one I'd traced from Simone's V. "You're smarter than she said, but the acreage is still worth $3 million. This isn't over." I deleted the message. I didn't need to reply. The rain had stopped by the time we reached the house, leaving the driveway slick and reflective. True to my word, the 3 cardboard boxes were sitting at the edge of the curb. They looked small out there, cheap. The designer labels on the side were beginning to peel in the dampness. David stood in the foyer, looking at the space where Simone's slate gray runner used to be. I had already rolled it up and put it in the back of the truck. The original hardwood was exposed now, honey-colored and warm. "It feels different," David whispered. "It feels like the truth," I said. I didn't let him linger in the grief of the betrayal. I led him to the kitchen. I didn't ask him to help. I gave him a task. "Peel the potatoes, David, thick skins, deep eyes. Take your time." While he worked, I went to the garage one last time. I didn't go for the spices. I went for the black folder Simone had left behind in her haste. I sat at the workbench and opened it. Inside, tucked behind the forged deed, was a list of names. People V had used to facilitate the debt. Accountants, low-level bank clerks, a notary. They thought they were ghosts in the machine. They thought an elderly woman in a silk blouse wouldn't know how to trace a digital footprint. I pulled out my phone. I didn't call the police. I called Miller. "The names are in your inbox," I said, my voice barely a murmur. "Every person who touched that forgery. I don't want a spectacle. Miller. I want their licenses revoked. I want their reputations as clean as a bleached bone. By Monday." "And Simone?" Miller asked. "Simone is already gone," I said, watching a single crow land on the boxes at the curb. "She'll try to find V. She'll try to get her cut. Let her. By the time she reaches him, he'll be looking for someone else to blame. They deserve each other's company." I hung up. Strategic silence is a weapon, but strategic placement is a masterpiece. I returned to the kitchen. The smell of searing butter began to fill the air. Real butter, heavy and rich. I added the garlic, listening for the sizzle I had missed during that first cold dinner. "Ma," David said, his hands still busy with the potatoes. "What about the text? The one from V? He thinks I'm afraid of his numbers," I said, sliding the salmon into the cast iron. "He thinks the acreage is just land. He doesn't realize that land is only valuable if you can build on it. And I've spent the last hour filing for a historical preservation easement. This property can never be developed, David. It can never be a cushion for people like him. David finally smiled. It was a small, tired thing, but it was real. You turned the gold into lead. No, I corrected. I turned it into a sanctuary. We ate dinner in the dining room on the hand-embroidered tablecloth. There was no minimalist aesthetic, no curated tension, just the sound of forks against china and the steady hum of a house that knew its owner was back. As I finished my tea, the real blend, the one that stays with you, I looked out the window. A car was idling at the end of the driveway. I didn't need to see the license plate to know who it was. V was watching. He was seeing the lights on in the sunroom. He was seeing the boxes in the rain. He was realizing that he hadn't been playing against an old woman. He had been playing against the house itself. And the house always wins. I stood up and walked to the front door. I didn't lock it. I didn't need to. I simply turned on the porch light, the bright, unwavering beam that signals a home is occupied. The car at the end of the driveway pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the mist. I walked back to the kitchen and picked up a single salt shaker. I placed it exactly where it belonged, right next to the stove. People think revenge is a hot dish, a loud confrontation, a moment of explosive payback. But they're wrong. True payback is the quiet return to a life you were supposed to lose. It's the sound of a key turning in a lock that still belongs to you. It's the taste of a meal that wasn't poisoned by a lie. Simone is out there somewhere, realizing that her modern world is very cold when you have nothing left to trade. V is realizing that some roots go too deep to be pulled by a contract. And I'm exactly where I need to be. I looked at the camera, my expression calm, observant, and quietly dangerous. They say you can't go back home again. I whispered to the empty room. But they forget that some of us never left. We were just waiting for the guests to clear out. The dinner is over, the house is quiet, and the lesson has been delivered. If you enjoyed this journey into old school payback, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. You wouldn't want to miss what happens when the next guest overstays their welcome.